You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. Have you ever seen a black bear in Mississippi? Well, we certainly have them here. And today we are talking with Anthony Ballard, our Black Bear Program Coordinator at MDWFP.
Mississippi Outdoors is sponsored by Entergy Mississippi. Entergy is building a stronger and cleaner grid to power a brighter future and protect our great outdoors for generations to come.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. And today, an old friend, he's back, round two with Anthony Ballard, our Mississippi Bear Program Coordinator here at MDWFP. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, welcome back, I should say.
Yeah.
All right. So here you are in the studio, fresh off den checks, right?
Yes.
Like that just happened.
Yes. Fresh off den checks. I feel like a weight has been lifted off of me because that's always kind of the Super Bowl of the bear program or den checks. We had an inordinate amount this year. Had a lot of bears with cubs, and so it all went well. We got what we needed, and I'm glad to take a break for a while and take a deep breath. So.
Yeah, I heard Chip ask you a little while ago. He said, "How'd the den checks go?" And you were all thumbs up, like it went well.
Yeah. We had 7 sows this year with cubs. So sows only have cubs every other year. So depending on how the schedule works out, you may have more or less depending on the years. And then, of course, you have to have a sow that also has a collar on and is having cubs. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of hard to predict, on out how exactly that's going to work out.
So 7 sows that in the checks you found wearing collars that had
litters of cubs.
Litters of cubs.
Mm-hmm.
How does that compare to years prior in terms of the checks?
In 2023, when I came on, we did 6 den checks and only 2 of them had a litter of cubs. And also in 24, so that was last year, same thing. It wasn't the same ones, like I said, but it was still 6 sows with 2 cubs, 6 sows and only 2 had cubs.
Okay, 2 had cubs. And this year, again, let me get the numbers right, 7 that have cubs. Mm-hmm. So it's a really strong year.
Yeah, really strong year. And like I said, part of that is just kind of how the scheduling fell. But, all of them but one, the ones that I expected to have cubs actually did. So it was a really good year.
What part of the state were you in for those den checks?
Scattered most of the river counties. So scattered anywhere from Bolivar County all the way down to Wilkinson. So we had 1 in Bolivar, 2 in Sharkey, 2 in Warren, 2 in Wilkinson, 1 in Claiborne.
Okay.
Yeah.
What, I guess for, you mentioned those counties, and let's say that someone's listening and they live in those counties. So if there's 2 in this county and there's 1 that you checked here, what does that indicate maybe to you if you were to estimate the numbers or the populations in those counties? So they're obviously there. Mm-hmm. You check 1 den that's got a sow, she's got a collar cubs, but she's obviously not the only bear that's there. So
right, yeah, and really, the numbers of sows that we're working with, that we're doing these den checks on, not really meant to be indicative of any sort of population estimate or even a density estimate. What this is looking at reproduction specifically. So we're looking at the number of sows that we have, like I said, that are supposed to have cubs that we expect to. How many of those actually are having cubs? What are the litter sizes? What are the ages, the weights, sort of the health parameters on that reproduction? Not necessarily how many do we have in that area, because there's a whole lot more sows there that are having cubs than what we know and keep track of. It's more of just kind of taking that data and then looking at trends over time with it.
So a sow has cubs now, and you said it will be at least 2 years before she has more?
Yeah, so let's say the cubs, let's take a litter, for example, that had this year in 2025. So spring of 2026, those cubs will be right at a year old, right? Because they were born this spring and they were the next spring. So they'll actually den with her or around her again in spring of 26. And then the summer of 26, usually around May or June, they'll kind of disperse. The males can disperse a long ways, 10s or 100s of miles. The females of that litter usually stay fairly close. And then, so once they disperse, she'll breed again. And then, so the sow, like I said, if everything goes like it's supposed to, she had cubs here in 25, we can expect her to have another litter in 27.
Okay. So it's not taking a year off. It's still raising those babies. Right. They're still at home basically.
Yeah. And that's the thing. She might have a collar that whole time. So spring of 26, I'll know that she's not going to have a fresh litter of cubs, but we're still keeping tabs on, for example, how many of those cubs survive that first year, because after that, their survival chances go way up. And so we're constantly just keeping tabs on which ones are supposed to be doing what through the year.
What were the litter sizes?
On a mature sow, you're usually expecting 2 to 3. We had one this year that only had a single.
Okay.
Usually the younger sows have singles, and then 2 to 3 after that. We actually had one that had 4 this year, and they were all over 3 pounds. So that was a really, really good, big, healthy litter. So
that mama's got her hands full for the next year or two, huh?
Yeah, no doubt. And she was actually the biggest sow that we have on record in Mississippi. She was 312 pounds in Sharkey County. And I kind of joked and I said she ought to have 4 or 5 cubs, and I'll be dang, she actually did. She had a big litter. So
yeah, I may have asked you this before. The danger to those cubs, like in that first year, and they're with mama, and she's very protective. But what kind of things threaten, a young black bear in Mississippi that makes it, sort of tough to make it through those early years?
So you were talking about the density. Sometimes in those really bear dense areas, particularly along those river counties, there's going to have the big males. A lot of times will kill those cubs. They do that so the sow will go back into estrus, and they'll get to breed her a year earlier and pass on his genes versus somebody else's. So that's one of the kind of more brutal things but it is a reality. It's a source of mortality for the cubs. And then again, I mean, some of these bears are denning 50 feet high in a cypress tree. You can obviously have, accidents climbing down out of the dens. You can have, flood prone areas. You can have drownings, highways, obviously crossing roads and stuff like that. So you can basically narrow it down into either other bears or accidents.
Okay. See, up until now, I just didn't get it. When I heard den, I was thinking in the ground, in those places on the ground. I never considered or understood that they can also den up in a tree. You said 50 feet up in a tree.
Yeah. Especially those areas like take Steel Bayou, for instance, or a lot of those areas where the backwaters from the Mississippi come in and flood, most of the time when those floods happen are in the winter or the springtime. And so it's advantageous for a sow that's denned in one of those several 100-year-old cypress trees. The water can do whatever it wants to until she gets ready to come back down, and her and that new litter are not at risk. So it's one of those adaptations, those older, like I said, multi-year-old cypress trees are really good den habitat for that time of year.
Okay. All these factors, all these things that the information you come out of this season where you just finished the den checks, a great number of, sows that have had litters, different sizes. What does that tell you? What does that information that feedback tell you about the work you're doing and the bear population?
Yeah. Well, some of the stuff that we take, the information we take, we're actively using. So like I said, stuff like your the weights of your cubs, the overall health of your cubs. If there was some type of problem, maybe a disease that caused, reproduction problems or some kind of, parasite or whatever the case was, you can kind of preemptively look at that stuff and pick up trends. And then there's other things that we collect. So you're talking about the den types. So sometimes we have tree dens, sometimes we have dens in slash piles or brush piles. Sometimes we had 3 this year that were actually excavated into hillsides, kind of more like what you were probably picturing. And we take that data down. We don't necessarily use it, but we have it to look at. So let's say we had something come up later that we said, I wonder, what the average size of a den is, or what those kind of gee whiz things that you don't necessarily have to know right now, but you could look back at 20 years worth of data and you can get a pretty good picture of it.
Okay. So. What do you think long-term, this study, this program with the black bear, as a species in Mississippi, what does it mean for the everyday citizen? And, the hunter, the outdoorsman, sure, but just those of us in Mississippi, what does it mean to us that you are doing this work and tracking, and how does it impact us, you think?
Well, first of all, I can't take much credit. I mean, I've been in here since, in this position since 23. So there's been a whole lot more research and really good guys that have come before me to do this. But as far as the story of the black bear in Mississippi, we have a very unique story and a lot of rich history. People like Holt Collier and, Teddy Roosevelt and those stories that go all the way back to the 1800s. Black bears are sort of in the tail end of the timeline, I guess you could say, following in the footsteps of the white-tailed deer and the American alligator and all those species that we brought back from the brink of extinction almost, or at least to extirpation. now to being a prominent species. I mean, nobody in this generation thinks of deer as ever being scarce, but that was the case at one point. And so I like to think of it as being one of the last great comeback stories of a species here in the state of Mississippi, and probably one of the best. I mean, we had an estimated 12 bears in the state of Mississippi in 1932. And now we have, obviously to the point where we're catching, dozens in a year. So it's one of those things that I'm, like I said, I'm kind of the latest piece in that puzzle, kind of the part of that story, but it goes back way further and includes a lot of great people and conservationists.
Yeah. And you talked about the distance the males travel. I know we talked about that some the first time you were here, places they've been spotted in and around. I guess one question somebody listening might wonder is, okay, we talk about how far a bear that maybe is born here, a male, would travel and maybe even cross state line. But what about vice versa? What about a bear from Tennessee or one from Louisiana and them coming here? Do they ever come to Mississippi and sort of take up residence?
Yeah. So in the dispersal patterns, with a lot of species, bears included, you have, sort of your core areas, and then you have dispersal that comes, out and away from that from more dense to less dense. Right. And so with your dispersal patterns, like you said, with those young males, a lot of times they're dispersing into areas that aren't as bear dense. Mm-hmm. And generally speaking, that's going to be from places like Louisiana, the Tensas Basin, the Chaffalaya Basin, the White River area in Arkansas, and they're dispersing off to the east. That's why, the western side of Mississippi is one of the places that has the densest populations. So as that population progresses, it's going to keep spreading to the east. And then we also have in southeast Mississippi, a lot of those bears have actually come from the Mobile Basin in Alabama. Okay. And so you have sort of a convergence, and I would assume at some point it's going to cover most of the state in the as long as you have good habitat for them to disperse into.
Yeah. So fair to say the black bear population in Mississippi is steadily growing. Mm-hmm. Okay. So does that mean there are a few more human and animal interactions each year? Are we seeing more or no because of where they are?
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot of areas that there is not much human interaction just because they're pretty wild areas that don't have a whole lot of developments. But, that's kind of one of the things that we're looking forward into this program is, yes, we're going to have more human interactions, and yes, bears are going to be seen more. They're going to be in areas that people have never seen them before, and that those people maybe don't know how to react to seeing a bear. And so that's kind of where my mind is, kind of getting out in front of that and trying to be proactive in our education where, it may be that somebody's never seen one before, but they might have read something or seen something that we put out or somebody else, that they know the steps to take, to possibly preempt conflict or to handle that situation.
Okay. Yeah. Which really is, I would think, I guess in your line of work, you've just got den check behind you for this cycle, but year round, it's an education process with talking to the public, talking to me, and putting the word out, not only about the program, what it's doing, but okay, here's what you do if you come across one. Let me educate you about, the sort of their temperament and what they're after. Yeah. That's a year-round thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And usually, den check season right here in the spring, a lot of the bears are denned up, and so you don't see them as on the landscape as much. They're not feeding as much. Yeah. And, it's kind of in the back of everybody's mind. This is about the only time of year, this several month period right here, where I'm not out doing some kind of, talk or presentation or whatever, putting stuff out. We'll have a lot of stuff coming out here pretty soon, bear related, education related. But yeah, that's a big part of the job for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about den checks. You just went through those. We got the numbers. For those, again, listening that don't know, maybe they didn't hear the first time you were here on the Mississippi Outdoors podcast. What is the process of a den check? What's it like? What happens?
Yeah. So I mentioned that we only do den checks on collared females. So females that we already have collars on.
Meaning where they are.
Maybe.
Okay. All right.
So they're GPS collars. Okay. So if let's say that bear dens in a brush pile somewhere, it's not very dense, and that GPS can still transmit a signal to where it is.
Okay.
At that point, I'll have a nice little stack of points. I know exactly where she is. Okay. If she goes into a cypress tree, guess what you can't get inside of a cypress tree? Satellite reception.
Okay.
So your GPS at that point is useless. So depending on where that bear dens and how dense that cover is, I may know exactly where she is within 5 meters, or I have no idea, and she just kind of dropped off the face of the earth. So we'll either go into that location and physically find the den. We'll do that either way. Or we'll get an aircraft. I'll get in a Cessna 172. We've got antennas that go on both wing struts, and it also has a VHF transmission on those collars as well. So like the old school telemetry that people use, like triangulation and all that kind of stuff, we've got those two antennas. So I can actually circle those areas once I get the signal, and I can isolate left or right, and we can basically make passes on that bear to where we can narrow down pretty close where she is. And then we'll go in. That'll usually get me within a couple hundred yards. This year I missed one, two of them by about 30 yards. So kind of proud of that actually. But then but even still, we'll go in, we'll find exactly where the den is, how big the opening is. We'll flag the trails to get into it, and we'll figure out on the day of the den check exactly the trails we're going to follow, where we're going to take the shot from, and all that kind of stuff is kind of, handled on the front end to where on the day of the den checks, it goes as smooth as it possibly can.
And take the shot with a tranquilizer, obviously. Right.
Yep.
And so but all that you described, it's kind of like high-tech hunting, just sort of in a different vein. You're not actually harvesting an animal, but other than that, taking into consideration, of course, you've got the help of the GPS sometimes, but still it's like high-tech hunting is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I'd imagine your heart rate gets up at times.
Yeah, it's a lot like hunting. I had to belly crawl into one this year, and I mean, when I'm taking these shots, it's usually 5 yards or less. I mean, it's right there close.
Okay.
And one that I had to dart this past Friday actually was about from me to you, and so
really,
and she was bluff charging, huffing at me and everything. So yeah, it can get.
Were you
standing?
standing?
Hairy. No, I was kind of crouched down because her den was on the ground, and there was so much cover and stuff on the top that I had to get down like interface to finally get a shot.
From me to you. Okay. And I remembered what you described about the sense of smell for black bear, which is incredible.
Yeah. Very good.
So they know, I mean, long before you even get that close, they know you're there.
Yeah. And I mean, that's another thing in the preparation for a den check is I look at the, not only the weather, obviously, but I look at the wind direction too. I try to play that the best I can. I try to get in on a windy day where it kind of masks my movements a little bit, my sound. They know you're there. They know you're there. The only one that I think I probably snuck up on earlier this year was one that was in a ground den, and she was dug out. The opening was pretty small, and I was able to come up just right beside the den and just stick my head in and dart her and come back out. Mm-hmm. And but 9 times out of 10, they know you're there and they're looking at you when you get there.
Chip, I don't know about you, but being that close to really any live animal, let alone a bear. Okay. And I know how many years of experience for you actually being in on the darting process
I did my first ones in spring of 23.
Okay.
I did a dart. I went on one time.
I thought you mentioned that to me.
Yeah.
And the bear got darted and then it ran and it was flooding. And
I know that story.
The biologists had to run after the bear because they were afraid that they didn't want it to drown. Right. So that's what they were nervous about. And, but the bear was fine. They didn't have to be a lifeguard for a bear that day.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that's the thing. There's so many things. The one I was talking about getting so close, the dart actually deflected, and then she busted out of the back of the den. We waited for her to come back, and so it's a constant little game of chess to see which way could she possibly get out of the den. What happens if she does this? What happens if the dart? I mean, there's all these factors you're trying to consider as you're going in and doing it. So I get very little sleep during den check. That's why I'm saying I feel like a weight's off of me now.
Well, but you're not alone on those operation, not by yourself.
Yeah, usually what I try to do is I'll have myself as the primary darter, and then somebody else I've got a pistol and a rifle. So either I'll have the rifle and they'll have the pistol, or vice versa, where that way, let's say that I miss, or the dart, whatever the case is, hits a vine, let's say, I'll at least have another dart loaded, ready to go close by. So if I need to grab it, and then I also carry a spare in a little like chest harness that I have too.
So kind of like backups for backups.
It's a multi-layered contingency plan all the way through. Until you never know how it's going to happen until you've actually got the sow asleep in the den, and then you can kind of relax and just kind of monitor everything and work the cubs up.
From the time she takes the dart to the time that she's asleep, how long does that take?
It depends on where the dart hits. So we try to hit either neck, shoulder, or rump. Okay. The neck shots, take effect a little quicker, but on average 5 to 10 minutes, and they're asleep.
Okay. Yeah. 5 to 10 minutes.
And during that time, you also have to be really careful too, because the drug that we use, it makes them really kind of nose heavy. So they'll try to nose down. And if you don't be careful, they'll kind of cut their airway off, fold their nose down into the ground or into themselves. And so you got to pay really close attention to making sure they're breathing, make sure they're not squishing cubs. And so you kind of get to that point where, like, I really hope she's asleep enough for me to reach my hand in there and lift her head up and make sure she's getting air. So it's, like I said, once she's asleep and you got her started on the oxygen, we run O2 on all of them, then you can you're in monitoring mode then, instead of what if this happens sort of thing.
What was it like the first time that, like you just described, I hope she's asleep, and you put your hands physically on a live bear, whether it's moving a snout or nudging her one way or the other? The first time you did that, what was that experience like?
It's totally different from trapping, because I had worked up bears in traps before. The first one that I ever actually worked up in 23 was in a brush pile. And so you had to kind of go over a log and then down. And then once you got down there, it was almost kind of like a beaver hut. So it went down and then back up again. And when I got down to where she was, we were 3 or 4 feet apart looking at each other. And she was facing me, and I've got to take a neck or a shoulder shot. And when you're facing me like this, I can't take either. Yeah. So we're just sitting there looking at each other. And after 30 or 45 seconds, probably, she finally turned her head like this, and I shot, and it stuck in her collar.
Oh no.
And I went, crap. Of course, those collars are so thick. Yeah. There was no medication that actually got in under her skin to make her go to sleep. So again, that's why we have a primary and secondary. So I was able to get the other dart and get a dart in her at that point, and she went to sleep. But man, it was a little tense there for a minute.
Anthony, it takes, this, you're being humble, but man, it takes nerves of steel to crawl in and to be that close and do all that, like in a brush pile or underneath or in a den, nose to nose with a live black bear. And I know that we hear it's not like grizzly, they're not as aggressive and all that, but everyday Joe walking around, I can't even imagine doing that.
Yeah, and another good thing, I used to work at a vet clinic, and so I've gotten used to, over those times, sort of reading body language, figuring out what an animal may and may not do, and kind of what they're trying to tell you, and that's, people are calling me all the time worried about, the bear's going to attack me or my dog or my, whatever, and I'm like, if there's anybody that should have been attacked, it should have been either me or one of my predecessors, Yeah. And, but most of the time in that situation, they're going to turn away from you. They're going to cower. They may, huff at you and bluff charge like that one did. And right after she did that and I didn't move, immediately she started looking around for which way she was going to get out of the den, because it was like she made that one little jump and said, okay, well, that didn't work. And then she tries to get out of there. And they really just don't want to be close to you. And, there's always that little bit of doubt in your mind, but you kind of learn to read the situation.
Sure. Bluff charge.
Yeah.
And that's just sort of, when's the first time you experienced that?
Well, in traps, but it's pretty easy to keep it together when they're in a trap.
Sure.
But it happened. Well, the first time I ever, I guess, was technically bluff charged was in that, the den, the tree den last year, actually the last 2 years. There's a sow there that just hates to see us coming, and I was hanging 50 feet off a rope at that point, and she was, from me to you also, but it was in a tree, so she was kind of down in a little pocket, and she'd huff and slap at the tree and pop her jaws and all that.
Wow. Yeah, I think it's one of those where I can't imagine the adrenaline rush either. It's to what you're describing. Yeah, we compared it to hunting and other types of hunting, and that moment, and your heart gets to beating fast. But I think that proximity, even though you're not harvesting the animal, you're going to dart it and do the study. That's to me, I would think that's a whole different kind of adrenaline rush.
It is, yeah. And I kind of compared it to hunting, but so let's say you were hunting in that situation. Once you take that shot, well, now you could instantly disable that animal and have them go down right there, or it's at least going to be to where they're going to leave and they're going to go somewhere else. Yeah. But after I take that dart shot, nothing really changes. I mean, it takes 5 to 10 minutes for that drug to take effect. We're still sitting in close proximity looking at each other. The only difference is now she's got something that just stung her and she doesn't know why, and I'm still standing there. Mm-hmm. So it's and again, there's also a certain amount of pressure because there's a lot of people that the landowners and that kind of thing that generally can come to these events, and so it's like I've got these people that are with me, and then I've also got the staff that are with me, trying to make sure everybody stays safe and that everybody goes right. And you can only make up so many darts to make sure that one lands where it's supposed to.
Yeah.
So
this may be a really dumb question. Just tell me if it is. But is there a necessity for you, someone in your position and you in your position, to stay like physically fit and in shape enough to be able to move around and potentially quickly move around, get out of the way if you need to? Is there a necessity in a job like that?
Yeah, not necessarily get out of the way, but I actually did. I actually lost about 10 pounds in preparation for den checks and that was mostly for the climbing aspect of it.
Okay.
Because whenever we climb, I mean, you're pushing your own body weight, up that rope, and if you're gassed and useless by the time you get to the top of that tree, it makes everything that much harder. Because you still got to keep yourself together enough to take a shot, to take a dart shot and make sure, keep your wherewithal about you to make sure that everything goes right. So, yeah, I do. I work out a good bit leading up to it, and there's a lot of preparation. Wilkinson County and Claiborne, those hills are just straight up and down, and a lot of times we're covering a lot of ground before you get there. So you don't want to be winded and out of breath in the situation where you're about to take that shot.
Right. What is it they do in the Rocky movies? They go chop logs.
Chop logs. Yeah. Pull a sled up the hill in the snow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Usually mine is a lot of Stairmaster and some free weights and treadmill.
Yeah.
For the most part.
But it makes total sense, just like you said. I mean, because you wouldn't want to be there and be prepared in every other way, but physically unprepared.
Right.
Muscles giving out, calf muscles cramping up, and you're at the top of you can't have that.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of times, those dens, it's amazing the stuff they can squeeze into. And so, a lot of those ground dens this year were really tight, and you had to kind of contort to get in there, down into them. And so catch a cramp at the bottom of those, one of those dens, it's tough to straighten back out. So. Sure.
What are the cubs like? Once the mother is asleep in the den check and there's cubs there, what's that interaction like with the cubs?
It is undescribable to know the feeling it's like when you first get down there, she's asleep, and you pick up one of those cubs for the first time. Because you're the first human that's ever touched that cub. You're the first time they've ever seen anything like that. They're 3 or 4 weeks old, and usually I'm picking them up and then handing them to somebody else so we can take them and start the workup. But it is a really, I don't know, intimate is the word that I keep thinking about. Like it's you're in there. The only thing those cubs have ever known is that den and that mama sow. And then, you're coming in to collect your data. Like there's part of it that's like driven of like, here's the task, here's the next thing. I've got to check this off the list. But then there's another part of it where it's like, man, this is so cool to be in this little spot. And this is the first time that I've ever touched these bears, and maybe the only time, who knows?
Yeah. Some of the pictures I've seen of you in the past on like the Mississippi Black Bears Facebook page, where you got those little cubs sitting up on your shoulder.
Yeah. Yeah.
And okay, again, I'm judging it by a picture, but it looked to me like they're actually maybe a little smaller than I would have anticipated. You think about a bear cub, you think, but they're little bitty things at that time.
Yeah. The general, like this year we had 15 cubs that we ended up working up. I think the smallest was 2 pounds and the biggest was almost 5.
Okay.
Yeah. So
that's really small.
Yeah. Pretty small.
Yeah.
And they're, 11, 12 ounces when they're born. So,
yeah. What about the makeup of male to female of the cubs that you found this year?
Usually they're pretty balanced. We had 3 litters this year that were kind of male heavy. They had 2 males. But in general, if there's 2, I'll expect 1 of each, that kind of thing. They're generally pretty balanced.
Okay. What would be your message here again, another opportunity to talk to folks who are listening to this podcast, interested in the outdoors and in nature and wildlife in our home state of Mississippi? What is your overall sort of message to them about the black bear and about the black bear program at MDWFP?
Well, a lot of education goes into that, and I feel like we're kind of in a good spot because a lot of people in Mississippi, especially hunters and outdoorsmen, they have fixed ideas about turkey. They have fixed ideas about deer, and with the black bear, first of all, we've never brought them into the state. People think that. People think we're still moving them around. So for anybody out there, we're not. Please help me dispel that rumor. But what I tell people is, this is an animal. It's not my job to get you to like bears. It's my job to make sure that you have the knowledge available to avoid conflict the best you can and to know as much about the species as possible. And, it's like I said, it's a rebound story. And so, the more information we can get about bear biology, bear habitat, the way they use the landscape, and again, things like stuff around the house. If you have a bear that wanders by, he's going to get in the trash if it's out. He's going to get into a barbecue grill or a bird feeder or, pet food that's left on the back porch. That little stuff like that. If I can reach that person and they take that preemptive action and they don't cause a conflict, and that bear never goes to their front porch and they scare the heck out of each other, that's a win for me and it's a win for the bears.
Mm-hmm. And by and large, they're just not venturing into like highly populated or dense neighborhoods and that kind of thing. It's pretty much, they're in rural areas and every now and then venturing across the road or into someone's yard if they're living kind of out.
Yeah, generally speaking, suburban is what I would more describe than urban. Generally, if you have a bear that's in the middle of, let's say, downtown Vicksburg or Natchez or whatever, most of the time that's going to be a young male because, like I said, and usually it's going to be in the summer, May, June, July, because they're out on their own for the first time. So think of like a spike, a deer that's going to be out in the food plot in the middle of 3 o'clock in the afternoon because they don't know any better yet, and they're going into those areas, they're following their nose, and they're out for the first time trying to figure out how to be a bear. And so those are the ones that are going to find themselves in situations where they make the news because they're up a tree in the middle of an apartment complex somewhere because they didn't know any better. They're following their nose, they smelled the dumpster, and there they are. And then the other situation would be if that's a learned behavior. So if it's an adult bear, Smoky Mountains, for instance, you have a huge population of bears, very dense. Yeah. You also have a very dense amount of people in that, like Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg area. Yeah. So you have a huge, tourism of people that don't generally interact with bears, and you have a whole lot of bears. And so that's where you can get a lot of conflict and, bears that have learned that behavior, how to seek out food sources. And then you also have people, unfortunately, that come and feed those bears. So there's constant problems there. And so that's kind of what I'm, looking to avoid, passing that information on the best you can about here's the do's and don'ts of living around in bear country,
I got a story being up in that area, Gatlinburg. We were on a bachelor trip, and the place that was hosting the cabin we were staying at, they weren't doing the trash pickup to the point where we needed to call. We were like, you need to come get the trash, or we're going to have animals out here. Well, the last night, I've never seen a bear in the wild, but I saw a bear on that front porch, and it was taller than I'd ever expected a black bear to get, and it ate nearly all that trash. I think we slid a couch in the front door because we're afraid it'd probably want to get some more food on the inside.
Yeah.
And that's probably not the first time she's done that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
I had the same experience, same place. I think it was, outside of Gatlinburg, up in a cabin up there, and heard something one day, and it was just a black bear getting in the trash can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was from the people who had been there before. And so really, that's different population, different area, but what you're speaking to here, I mean, that's really the main educational piece about the interactions. Don't feed them. And if you do see one, it's probably after the trash can,
right?
Bird feeder, that sort of thing.
It's like a big raccoon. That's what I like to think of.
Yeah. And, a lot of our information we use for that is bearwise.org. That's one of the sites that's been put together by wildlife agencies across the Southeast. And, for kind of the ABCs, I guess you could say, like the building blocks of, being around bears and bear conflict. That's a one-stop shop for all the what ifs you could ever ask.
Okay.
So.
Bearwise.org. Bearwise.org. Anthony, not Andrew,
right.
Anthony. Really do appreciate you coming by again. It's a pleasure. Congrats on a good year.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right. That's the Bear Truth. I'm sorry. Had to do it. Thanks for listening to the show, and we'll see you outdoors.